Hi everyone, welcome back to another video of Mike's Geek Corner with your host, Mike Quevedo. This time I'm going to review the short-lived cult classic animated series of Superman from 1988, produced by Ruby Spears. It aired on Saturday mornings on CBS and ran from September 17th to December 10th of 1988, with a total of 13 episodes. It was supposedly not renewed for a second season due to the property's licensing fee costing too much, as well as poor ratings due to poor scheduling. Ruby Spears' Superman is a pretty underrated cult classic. While its animation is clearly not of the Max Fleischer quality and its characters and dialogue may not be as grounded as its mid-90s successor, Ruby Spears delivered a much appreciated, refined animated series for the Man of Steel, succeeding quality-wise over much of what either Filmation or Hanna-Barbera attempted earlier with the character. The show embraced the spirit of the Christopher Reeve live-action movies, the classic Fleischer animated shorts, the George Reeves TV show, a bit of the Still British sentimentality, as well as the 80s comics run. And despite the absence of many of Soup's rogues gallery, the show's original villains are so delightfully imaginative, you might actually yearn for DC to use them someday in some capacity. Story goes that CBS was looking to do a Superman animated show and hired seasoned comic book writer Marv Wolfman, who had already written for Superman comics in the early 80s, to write a pilot. Wolfman was inspired by the classic Fleischer Superman cartoons and wanted to bring the same sense of danger, while at the same time bring more gravitas to characterization than had been done previously in any animated iteration of Superman. Although Wolfman struggled a little with the standards and practices of network television, his treatment still managed to retain a gratifying level of uncompromised commitment to not only stay true to the comic book lore of Superman, but also apply an edge to the show as far as content. Head of CBS Kids Judy Price came up with the idea of adding the Superman Family album 4-minute segments that would follow at the end of each episode, showcasing biographical pieces from Clark's infancy, his adolescence, and his adulthood as reporter and as Superman. After Marv Wolfman's pilot got approved, the project landed at Ruby Spears for production, where more expensive animation by Japan's Toei and Korea's Taiwan was provided than usually was for Saturday morning fare, as one drawing was done for every 2 frames, as opposed to the common use of 3 frames. Late legendary comic book artist Gil Kane, who had previously collaborated with Marv Wolfman in the Superman comics, provided character designs with Ruby Spears' frequent storyboard artist John Dorman serving as art director. Writers who contributed to the show are Bronze Age Superman comics scribe Martin Pasco, Thundarr the Barbarian and Dungeons & Dragons writers Steve Gerber and Buzz Dixon, and He-Man writers Larry DiTilio, Karen Wilson, Chris Webber, and Michael Reeves, with Transformers writer Sherry Wilkinson mainly handling the Superman Family album segments. For villains, Wolfman, not finding Soup's established rogues gallery that compelling, had new foes for most episodes. Lex Luthor is a recurring threat, and Zod and his 2 cohorts, the Prankster, and a version of Shadow Thief also appear. But there's no Brainiac here, mainly due to the character's continuous morph in the comics, nor is there any presence of Bizarro, Mr. Mxyzptlk, Metallo, or Toyman. We do have, however, very inspired foes that effectively stand in for some of the classic rogues and or provide a sense of even more danger and dread. I personally wish DC would use some of these villains at some point. More on them in a bit. Wolfman decided to use the more classic tropes of the pre-Crisis Superman mythos and the Christopher Reeve movies as a basis for the characterizations and look of the main characters. The title character shared the optimistic personality and sense of humor of Christopher Reeve's Man of Steel, as well as Clark Kent's bumbling facade, which are solidly voiced by Bo Weaver, who had already done work for CBS's Mighty Mouse and New Adventures as the show's narrator, and go on to voice Reed Richards in the 90s Fantastic Four animated series. Lois Lane is displayed with her ever intrepid and snarky qualities, as well as her gushing over Superman, as former Hanna-Barbera voice actress Ginny McSwain brings the raspiness of Margot Kidder's Lois in the Reeve films, along with feistiness. Photographer, cub reporter Jimmy Olsen is given the classic face of Jeepers, with Mark Taylor, who had previously voiced Firestorm in the last 2 installments of the Super Friends, providing the proper night bed for the boys. After having lent his voice to villainous characters such as Gorilla Grodd in Challenge of the Super Friends, Quasimodo in The Incredible Hulk, and Brainiac in the Superpowers team, voice veteran Stanley Ralph Ross takes on the nicer role of tough but reasonable Daily Planet editor-in-chief Perry White, who, like John Hamilton's portrayal of White in The Adventures of Superman, also remarks with Great Caesar's ghosts. Clark's adoptive parents from Smallville, Jonathan and Martha Kent, are voiced by seasoned voiceover actors Alan Oppenheimer and Tress MacNeille, respectively. Michael Bell returns to voicing another iconic comic book character as the main foil, Lex Luthor, after playing Bruce Banner in The Incredible Hulk and Dr. Octopus in an episode of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. This version of Luthor is a multi-rich industrialist like in John Byrne's Man of Steel 1986 comic book revamp, along with Kryptonite Ring, and has the humor and personality of Gene Hackman's version in the live-action films. Coming off Star Trek The Next Generation and DuckTales, for Superman, composer Ron Jones puts on a score that captures the same spirit of excitement, thrilling fun, and lightheartedness that John Williams established in Richard Donner's film. Speaking of John Williams, in the opening sequence of the show, Ron Jones reorchestrates a bit of Williams' classic Superman theme. And speaking of the opening sequence, it also uses a narration of the Adventures of Superman show, delivered by Superman's narrator, Ted Knight. When this show aired, I think I got to see 3 or 4 episodes as far as I can recall, likely due to it being showed very early in the morning, and I didn't always feel like waking up that early, even on Saturday mornings. Now, during my childhood in the 80s, I liked Superman. I liked the Christopher Reeve movies, the VHS tapes of the Max Fleischer cartoons, I had some comics, I owned the Superpowers action figure, but I wasn't as geeked out about the character the same way I was for Batman and Spider-Man. Maybe it was because Bats and Spidey had better villains, or maybe Superman was just too powerful that the stakes didn't feel as compelling. However, by the mid-90s, Superman had become a more interesting character to me than before, as he had taken on foes such as Doomsday, Mongul, and the Cyborg. Then comes Superman the Animated Series in 1986, and now Supes rivals Spidey in my geek meter, so much that I now start to appreciate the character's past iterations even more than before. When I was finally able to see the Reeves Pierce show again years later, the revisit did not disappoint. As a fuller Superman fan, I was now able to appreciate the series for the sentimentality that Marv Wolfman and company laid out in a way that any aficionado of Superman, be it from the 40s to 80s comics, the Reeve movies, the Max Fleischer shorts, and the Adventures of Superman show, would relish. Now let's talk about some of the episodes and what the writers bring to each. In the first episode, Destroy the Defendroids, Lex Luthor's creation, the Defendroids, a unit of powerful law enforcement robots, proved to be so effective and make Superman's efforts look unneeded in Metropolis. And so, after it is announced that Superman has retired, Lois gets a hunch that Luthor orchestrated crimes so to make his Defendroids look good, and make Superman quit so he won't interfere in another grand scheme he's plotting with the help of his Defendroids involving a train carrying $1 billion in gold bullion to Fort Knox. In this pilot, Marv Wolfman presents a Superman adventure that resounds the pulpiness of the glorious Max Fleischer short, The Mechanical Monsters, as well as establish a tone for the series that makes it solidly clear that this is a show made for fans of the character from his golden age to modern age exploits. Fugitive from Space sees 2 aliens, Salandra and Argan, being found in suspended animation by Clark, Lois, Jimmy, and Starlab scientists in a crashed spaceship, and after they are awakened, the aliens display hostility towards each other as one accuses the other of being a dangerous criminal. As Superman attempts at figuring out which of them is a criminal, the supposed true criminal is planting alien eggs around the city with the intent to take control of the planet. This episode's writer, Martin Pasco, had previously touched upon similar material as a staff writer in Ruby Spears' earlier animated action fantasy show, Thundarr the Barbarian, with the episode Island of the Body Snatchers, where one of the main characters, the sorceress Ariel, has a spell cast upon her by an evil crone named Circe, which makes the 2 magic wielders switch bodies, leaving the transformed Ariel with her work cut out in convincing Thundarr and Nuclear she's the real Ariel and Circe, the false Ariel. We then move to the episode By the Skin of the Dragon's Teeth, written by Karen Wilson and Chris Webber, where Lex Luthor, after pressuring the Great Wall of China, lures Superman into rescuing Lois, Jimmy, and China's Minister of Culture, Madame Nuqua, beneath the Great Wall in Luthor's exhibition ferry, and after an arranged dynamite explosion causes the Great Wall to collapse, Superman, using his uncanny ability to create a tunnel to help his friends get away from the falling debris of the explosion, inadvertently uncovers the hidden treasure of the terrifying stone-imprisoned Dragon King, Lung Wang, just as Luthor had planned. What Luthor didn't plan for was the outcome of removing the magic tooth from the gargantuan imprisoned dragon, as Lung Wang comes back to life after centuries to once again terrorize China. While Lois, Jimmy, and Madame Nuqua engage in a chase after the fleeing Luthor and his assistant, Superman must try to overcome the Dragon King, whose power derives from magic, one of the Man of Steel's weaknesses. Superman had already tangled with a revived giant-scaling monster in the medium of animation in the 40s Max Fleischer short, The Arctic Giant, and this episode seems to delightfully capture a bit of the classic monster mayhem. For Wilson and Webber, this is also somewhat familiar territory after having written an episode of She-Ra called The Crown of Knowledge, which sees the villainous Hordak also using another character's motivation to obtain the magical Crown of Knowledge. As mentioned earlier, Brainiac does not appear in the series, but the episode Cybron Strikes, written by Buzz Dixon, does have the coding of the classic villain's exploits, as an ultra-powerful cyborg from the future named Cybron, voiced by Frank Welker after previously voicing Darkseid in the Super Friends, transforms an entire government facility, as well as Lois and Jimmy, into his obedient cyborgs, with the intent to conquer the Earth by cyberizing it. Superman takes Lois and Jimmy to Star Labs in order to break them free from Cybron's control, and then, putting aside the concern of Lois and Jimmy learning that Superman and Clark Kent are one and the same, figure out a way to reach Cybron's central computer within his pyramid so to stop his conquest. Marv Wolfman and Gil Kane had previously collaborated in the Superman stories Behold the Ultimate Man in Superman Special No. 1, and the 2-parter Rebirth in Action Comics No. 544 to 545, all from 1983. And both stories have elements that are shared with this episode, as Behold the Ultimate Man features a scientist who transforms himself into a highly powerful intelligent being who demands the total obedience of mankind, or else they will feel his wrath. And in Rebirth, we find Brainiac, after obtaining a new body, making his way to a planet where he converts the population into his slaves. After having written the episode Spider-Man Unmasked for Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which dealt with Spidey finding himself in a dilemma after the villainous Sandman witnessed the web-slinger change back to his identity of Peter Parker and threatened to expose his secret, Michael Reaves places Superman in a similar situation in the episode The Big Scoop, as Lex Luthor, by a stolen invention called the Chronotron, which allows his user to gaze into the future, witnesses Clark Kent turn into Superman while at a horse race in which he was using the Chronotron to win. Lex executes a plan to force Clark to appear on a live TV show in order to force him to turn into the Man of Steel, as he intends to launch a missile onto an innocent crowd while Clark is on the show. In Triple Play, written by Larry DiTillio, we get some goofy Golden Age type fun, as we are treated to a plot that showcases a prankster, voiced by Howard Morris, who had previously played Dr. Sivana in Legend of the Superheroes, putting into effect his desire for revenge against not only Superman for stopping his siege of crime, but also on Josh Cook for having sentenced him to prison, along with Lois Lane for writing the article of his crime, and Jamie Olsen for taking pictures that incriminated him. Since he missed many games from the World Series during his incarceration, the prankster, through the use of a transporter ray, has a World Series, including the players, Lois and Jimmy, transported to a far-off remote island, and once Superman arrives on the island, he has explained by the prankster that the lives of the abducted players, Lois, Jimmy, and Josh Cook, will be forfeited unless Superman, in a private World Series on the island, joins the prankster's robotic baseball team against the human baseball players. However, the prankster has also established a mad win-win scenario in his favor, for if his team loses, Lois and Jimmy are doomed, and if they do win, the judge is done for. Previously, in the He-Man episode, Disappearing Dragons, Larry DiTillio laid out a plot involving the Rogues, Cobra Khan, and Webstor, also using a transporter ray that ends up transporting He-Man from Eternia to the planet Miro, where He-Man is forced by the planet's rulers, the Dharmi, to fight in a gladiatorial arena against their massive robot champion, Bellatron, in exchange for the imprisoned dragons of Eternia. Triple Play also echoes some of the dynamics of DC Comics Presents number 41 from 1982 in the story The Terrible Tinseltown Treasure Trap Treasury, which also featured the prankster on a path to settle an old score, in taking Perry White hostage as leverage, and to find and rescue him, Superman has to team up with the Joker, who has been betrayed by the prankster, in order to find and rescue Perry. Chris Webber and Karen Wilson put together another effectively inspired episode with The Hunter, where we find the nefarious Kryptonian overlord of old Krypton, General Zod, voiced by Renee Auberjonois, but also voiced as Zod in Super Friends, imprisoned within the Phantom Zone, along with his inmates Faora and Ursa, as he dwells on revenge against the Man of Steel for their incarceration by Superman's father Jor-El, before Ursa informs Zod of her chemical pool, which the three Kryptonian rogues use to materialize their thoughts of a creature powerful enough to destroy Superman. Once the hulking being called the Hunter, voiced by Peter Cullen, is fully realized with its power to transform into any substance it touches, he sets forth to find his intended prey. And with the eventual help of Kryptonite, the Hunter accomplishes what neither Lex Luthor or any villain was able to do: kill Superman. Possibly due to story editor Marv Wolfman being brought up as a Marvel fan in the 60s, this episode displays a structure that can recall Journey into Mystery number 114 from 1965, where Loki, residing far away in fabled Asgard, driven by his loathing of Thor, empowers the convicted criminal Crusher Krill with the ability to absorb the properties of any physical matter he makes contact with, hence making him a potential force to be reckoned with for the God of Thunder. Speaking of Marv Wolfman, he and co-writer Sherry Wilkinson have the Man of Steel team up with his iconic female counterpart in Superman and Wonder Woman vs. the Sorceress of Time, where, after Superman destroys a comet that was headed to Earth, a fragment of it lands on Themyscira and shatters the crystal prison that was holding the twisted and powerful sorceress, Cyrene, voiced by B.J. Ward, who was formerly Wonder Woman's voice in Super Friends. Once freed, Cyrene begins using her sorcery by turning the Amazons into short-sized, hideous-looking creatures, and as Wonder Woman, voiced by Mary Lewis after having voiced Lady J in G.I. Joe, is ready to confront the sorceress, her mother, Queen Hippolyta, urges her daughter to leave the island and seek outside help, for if Cyrene manages to overpower her, she will use Diana to unseal the dangerous globe of darkness. After Wonder Woman reaches Metropolis and explains to Superman her situation, he joins her in helping stop Cyrene and free her mother and the other transformed Amazons from the sorcerer's siege. But Cyrene has sent monstrous mythological creatures to capture the Amazon princess, and though she and the Man of Steel manage to vanquish most of the creatures, Wonder Woman is eventually captured and taken back to Themyscira. Superman must now find a way to rescue Wonder Woman, and he also needs her help against Cyrene's goal of bringing back the Age of Sorcery forever. Wolfman's previous comic book work in Marvel seems to make its aura in this episode, for in his story in Fantastic Four Annual number 12 from 1977, Inhumans member Crystal also asked the Fantastic Four to return with her to Attilan to help the other Inhumans who have fallen prisoners to the powerful wizard Sphinx. And in Spider-Woman number 6 from 1978, Wolfman also had an ancient evil sorceress, the fabled Morgan Le Fay, making her astral form presence in the modern world with the intent of obtaining the mystical book called Darkhold, while Spider-Woman tries to stop her. In Bone Chill, written by Larry DiTillio, we now get into a more spooky environment involving a disgruntled and twisted bookstore owner named Chilton Bone, voiced by King Curtis, who was Grand Moff Tarkin in the 1981 Star Wars radio drama, who after prowling his way into the university, gets his hands on the ancient amulet called the Talisman of Ola, and becomes a terrifying skull-faced necromancer called Bone Chill, as he uses the amulet to bring monsters, be them from cinema or from beyond, to do his bidding. As Superman tries to stop Bone Chill, he must also rescue Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Perry White from captivities inspired by the literary work of Edgar Allan Poe. As also proven in the episode Shadow of Shakati Part 2 from He-Man, Larry DiTillio knows how to effectively put together a gloomy story for a kid's programming. The character of Bone Chill, particularly his skull face, looks like it could have been partly inspired by Skeletor, considering DiTillio's steady involvement on He-Man. But there's also a possibility that another DC villain with a skull face, Dr. Destiny, who used a Dreamstone in order to manipulate reality through dreams, might also have been a source for ideas. And then there's Tulsa Doom, Robert E. Howard's skull-faced necromancer from the cult story The Cat in the Skull, aka Vilcardi's Cat. The gloomy supernatural aesthetic continues with The Beast Beneath These Streets by Michael Reeves, as the mayor of Metropolis officially announces the restoration of Old Town, which is a part of Metropolis that was buried and sealed over 100 years ago after a driven scientist named Morpheus transformed himself into a hideous and vile bat-like mutant and ended up causing old Metropolis to be set in flames after being chased by the city folk. However, it turns out that Morpheus still lurks within the ruins of the abandoned city, and subsequently kidnaps Lois in order to lure Superman into a trap, which consists of a machine that removes the Man of Steel's powers and transfers them onto Morpheus, who, after incapacitating Superman, sets on a rampage to conquer Metropolis as he had attempted 100 years past. After recuperating from the encounter with Morpheus, Superman ponders how to regain his powers, as Morpheus tyrannically uses the immense power he stole to take over the city. Like Larry DiTillio, Michael Reeves also brings with him experience with establishing an element of dread, as he did in the episode The Evil Tree from Black Star, which I talked about in my previous review, and the episode The Boogeyman Cometh from the real Ghostbusters. He had also already handled a similar gimmick in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends with the episode Attack of the Arachnoid, which also featured a shady scientist named Sultan Amadeus, who, in an attempt to obtain the powers of Spider-Man, becomes a monstrous-looking half-man, has spider mutation, now named Arachnoid. Both Arachnoid and Morpheus also share the same voice actor, Dan Gilbison, who also voiced Spidey in Amazing Friends. Morpheus has a shared trait as well with the classic Superman rogue, the Parasite, who, with his powers to absorb the life energy of those he has physical contact with, has snatched the Man of Steel's powers in past encounters. Lastly, since Marv Wolfman did work on the John Carter of Mars comic run for Marvel in the 70s, not surprisingly on Superman we have a space opera called The Last Time I Saw Earth, courtesy of Steve Gerber, in which Lois and Jimmy, on assignment, board a space shuttle headed towards America's first interplanetary space station, the Intrepid, where they, along with the shuttle crew, are eventually kidnapped by an alien bounty hunter named Starrock, who somewhat resembles a Thark with his tusks, and after rendering or trailing Superman unconscious with one of his weapons, and then traveling through hyperspace, Starrock takes his captives to an alien city where his job of the Hot Like Hire submits the Earthlings to a feast to prove if they have the protein necessary to take from them so he and the other aliens can become immortal. Superman must not only regain consciousness soon, but he'll need help in finding the location where his friends are being held before it's too late. Steve Gerber had this shtick he used in comics where he took a character who had an established environment and subsequently placed him or her in an unusual scenario that contrasts with that character's standard day of adventure. Before he placed Superman away from Metropolis and Earth and into a space ghost type adventure, in Adventure to Fear number 22 from 1970, Gerber sent the urban settled vampire Morbius to another planet where instead of a sun, there's a glow sphere and it's ruled by cat demons and also inhabited by mutant denizens. And that same year he had the anthropomorphic Howard the Duck unwittingly leave Duckworld and arrive on Earth, which he finds is filled with talking hairless apes, as well as Man-Thing, Man-Frog, and a vampire cow. Another previous work from Steve Gerber that has some parallels to The Last Time I Saw Earth can be found in Daredevil 111 from 1974, where the title hero must find and rescue Shauna, the Jungle Princess, who has been captured by the Silver Samurai by the orders of the subversive mutant Mandrill, who intends to have Shauna subjected to an experimentation on her brain. So, hopefully I have made my case as to why this Ruby Spears production is such a criminally underrated cult classic gem within the pantheon of Superman animated shows. It stands very much as a crossroad between the heavily regulated superhero cartoons of the 70s and 80s and the more sharply written animated milestones of the 90s. I think it should be on anyone's top 5 of Superman cartoons. Any fan from the early Siegel Schuster years to all the way to the 80s, Marv Wolfman, John Byrne-Face, should appreciate the care brought to these episodes by the very talented writers and animators. As far as 80s cartoons based on pre-existing classic superheroes, Superman 88 and Spider-Man 81 are my two favorites. I only wish there could have been an episode which had Batman guest starring, but I believe that at the time another studio, Nelvana, had the rights to the character for a show called Batman and the New Robin, which never came to fruition. So the Superman 1988 animated show should be available to rent or buy digitally on YouTube, Google, Vudu, or Amazon Prime. You can also look for the 2009 DVD set on Amazon or eBay. Now, before I say goodbye, I just want to say thanks because Mike's Geek Corner has reached over 500 subscribers. Thank you all so much, and more greats are to come. And that's it for this review. Hope you enjoyed it. If so, please give it a like. Please make sure you subscribe, and feel free to leave your comments below. And I'll be seeing you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.